In the marble halls of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, 1941, there was no fear of the United States. There was only contempt. To Adolf Hitler and his inner circle, America was a joke. It was a mongrel nation, a chaotic mix of races, immigrants, and conflicting cultures that lacked the discipline of the Aryan master race. In the eyes of the German High Command, a country obsessed with jazz music, Hollywood movies, and consumer capitalism could never endure the horrors of total war. Hitler famously sneered at the American capacity for combat. In a conversation with his foreign minister, he dismissed the industrial giant across the Atlantic with a single, fatal sentence. "The Americans," he scoffed, "only know how to build refrigerators and razor blades." This was the delusion that would cost Germany the war. The Nazi leadership suffered from a fatal blindness. They confused a lack of desire for war with a lack of capacity for war. They looked at the United States Army in 1939, which was smaller than the Army of Portugal, armed with leftover rifles from World War I, and training with wooden sticks instead of machine guns, and they saw a weakling. But they forgot to look at the factories. What Hitler dismissed as consumer weakness was actually the most terrifying industrial engine the world had ever seen. He saw the Ford Motor Company producing millions of family cars and laughed. He didn't understand that a factory that can stamp out 1 million cars can, with a few adjustments, stamp out 1 million tanks. He saw a nation of shopkeepers and did not realize that mass production was a weapon far deadlier than the finest German engineering. German military attaches in Washington, D.C. tried to warn Berlin. They sent frantic reports back to Germany, detailing the sheer scale of American resources. They wrote about the steel mills in Pittsburgh that produced more steel in a month than Germany did in a year. They wrote about the oil fields in Texas that were virtually bottomless. Hitler threw these reports in the trash. He was blinded by his own ideology. He believed that will and spirit were superior to economics. He believed that a dedicated Nazi soldier was worth 10 soft Americans. On December 11, 1941, 4 days after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Hitler stood before the Reichstag. He didn't have to declare war on the United States. He was not bound by treaty to do so, but, driven by his arrogance and his belief that America was a hollow shell, he declared war anyway. It was the single greatest strategic error in military history. At that very moment, across the ocean, the refrigerator and razor blade makers were clocking in. The giant was not just awake, it was angry. In Detroit, the assembly lines stopped making Chevrolets and started making Sherman tanks. In Seattle, the Boeing plant stopped making mail planes and started making B-17 flying fortresses. Hitler had bet his empire on the idea that quality beats quantity. He believed his Tiger tanks, which were handcrafted masterpieces of engineering, could hold back the tide. He didn't understand that for every Tiger tank Germany built, Detroit would simply build 20 Shermans. It didn't matter if the Sherman was worse. It mattered that there were always more of them. The Germans were fighting a war of craftsmanship. The Americans were about to introduce them to the war of attrition. By the time the ink was dry on Hitler's declaration of war, the fate of the Third Reich was sealed. They weren't fighting a military. They were fighting a corporation. They were fighting a supply chain. They were fighting a nation that didn't just build weapons, but mass-produced death on a scale that the German mind couldn't even comprehend. The man who mocked the refrigerators was about to be crushed by the assembly line. February 1943. The scorched sands of Tunisia. This was the moment the Wehrmacht had been waiting for. 4 years. They had heard the rumors about the American paper tiger. Now, at a place called Kasserine Pass, the veteran soldiers of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps finally met the United States Army in battle. And at first, it seemed the German arrogance was justified. The battle was a humiliation for the Americans. Rommel's panzers, hardened by years of desert warfare, sliced through the inexperienced American lines like a hot knife through butter. American tanks were outmaneuvered. Their commanders were confused. Their soldiers were terrified. The US 2 Corps didn't just retreat, they routed. They left behind burning vehicles and hundreds of dead bodies. To the German commanders watching through their binoculars, this looked like victory. It looked like confirmation that the Americans were indeed soft, undisciplined amateurs who had no business on a European battlefield. But as the smoke cleared, and the German infantry moved forward to loot the captured American positions, the celebration turned into a cold, sinking feeling. A German soldier is trained to conserve. Every bullet is counted. Every drop of gasoline is precious. A broken tank is a crisis that requires immediate field repair. Germany was fighting a war of scarcity. But as they rummaged through the abandoned American jeeps and tents, they found something impossible. They found fresh coffee. They found unopened packs of cigarettes, thousands of them. They found chocolate bars, nylon stockings, and letters from home that were postmarked only weeks ago. One captured German diary entry from the time reads, "We are eating stale bread and drinking sour water. The Americans have cakes. They have meat. They have everything. How can we defeat a people who treat war like a grocery store?" But the real shock wasn't the food. It was the machines. After the battle, Rommel expected a pause. In European warfare, when an army loses 100 tanks, it takes months to replace them. The Germans expected the Americans to lick their wounds, retreat, and wait for supplies. Instead, the next morning, the Americans were back. And they were back with new tanks. The Germans watched in horror as the American supply lines effectively erased the defeat of the previous day. Did a Sherman tank blow a transmission? The Americans didn't bother fixing it. They shoved it into a ditch and uncrate a brand new one. Did a truck run out of gas? They didn't siphon fuel from another vehicle. They just brought up a tanker truck filled with thousands of gallons. The German concept of war was based on the decisive battle. You outmaneuver the enemy, you destroy his equipment, and he surrenders because he cannot fight. But in North Africa, Germany learned that you cannot fight a war of attrition against a conveyor belt. It didn't matter that the German Panzer IV was a better tank. It didn't matter that the German soldier was better trained. For every tank Rommel destroyed, the Liberty ships arriving in Casablanca unloaded 5 more. For every gallon of fuel the Germans struggled to smuggle across the Mediterranean, the Americans laid a pipeline. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, was one of the first to realize the truth. He wrote to his wife, lamenting the material superiority of the enemy. He realized that tactical genius is useless when the enemy has infinite reserves. The defeat at Kasserine Pass was the last time the Germans would smile at the Americans. They realized that while they were fighting for every inch of ground, the Americans were fighting with the resources of an entire continent behind them. The Americans had arrived. They were clumsy, yes. They were inexperienced, yes. But they were rich in the one currency that matters in total war: logistics. And they were bringing a storm of steel that would never, ever stop raining down. Here is the narrative text for Chapter 3, written in a powerful, fact-driven documentary style suitable for a voiceover. Chapter 3, Black Skies, the Air War and the Production Miracle. 2000 hours, 30:00. Narrator, by 1944, the arrogance of the Nazi regime had evaporated into the thin, freezing air over Europe. Early in the war, Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had famously boasted that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. If it did, he claimed, "You can call me Meyer," a common, derogatory Jewish name. By 1944, the German people were calling him Meyer every day. There is a specific moment that historians point to where the leadership of the Third Reich realized the air war was definitively lost. It wasn't a massive bombing raid. It was a sighting. Hermann Göring looked up into the skies over Berlin, skies that were supposed to be impenetrable, and saw something impossible. He didn't see a lumbering heavy bomber. He saw a small, sleek, single-engine fighter plane, the American P-51 Mustang. The Mustang had drop tanks, external fuel tanks, that allowed it to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Until that moment, German fighter pilots would wait until the Allied bombers were deep inside Germany, beyond the range of their fighter escorts, before attacking them like wolves on sheep. Now, the sheep had wolves of their own. Göring reportedly said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up, but the Mustang was just the tip of the spear. The real weapon was the shaft, American industry." While Germany was still building aircraft like artisanal clocks, handcrafting them in small batches, the United States was building them like Fords. The Willow Run plant in Michigan was a single factory building that was over a mile long. At its peak efficiency, raw materials went in one end, and a fully functional B-24 Liberator bomber came out the other end every 63 minutes. This created a mathematical reality that Germany could not survive. In 1944, the Luftwaffe was caught in a brutal war of attrition. A skilled German ace might shoot down 3 American bombers on a Tuesday. By Friday, those 3 bombers were replaced by 6 brand new ones, flown by fresh crews trained in the safety of Texas or Arizona. Conversely, when that German ace was finally shot down, he was gone forever. Germany was running out of machines, but more importantly, they were running out of experienced men. The Americans accepted horrendous losses. Tens of thousands of airmen died because they knew they could absorb the punishment. Germany could not. And then the Americans went for the jugular. In mid-1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces shifted strategy. They stopped just carpet bombing cities and started precision targeting Germany's synthetic oil plants. The results were catastrophic for the Reich. By the end of the war, German engineering had produced a miracle, the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was faster and more advanced than anything the Americans had. But it didn't matter. Hundreds of these technological marvels sat uselessly under camouflage netting in German forests. They were grounded because there was no fuel to fly them. American industrial might had not only outproduced the Luftwaffe, it had choked it to death. By D-Day, General Eisenhower could tell his troops, "If you see fighting aircraft over you, they will be ours." The lesson was brutally clear. German engineering could design a superior machine, but American mass production could darken the skies and blot out the sun. By the summer of 1944, in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Hurtgen, the German soldier had coined a new phrase for the conflict. They called it Materialschlacht, a battle of materials. But among the frontline grunts, they had a more bitter name for it, a rich man's war. To understand this bitterness, you have to understand the economics of a firefight. A German unit, low on ammunition and supplies, would fight with precision. A German machine gunner would wait until he had a perfect target. A German sniper would fire one shot, kill one man, and move. They fought with the desperate economy of a poor man. The Americans fought with the reckless extravagance of a billionaire. German POWs frequently complained to their captors about the unfairness of American tactics. One captured officer remarked, "We would attack with a squad of men. You would answer with a battalion of artillery. You do not fight. You annihilate." It was a simple, brutal calculation. If a German sniper fired from a church steeple, the Americans didn't send a brave soldier to clear the tower. They didn't risk a single life. Instead, they would radio a coordinate, and minutes later, the entire church, the steeple, and the surrounding city block would simply cease to exist under a barrage of 105mm and 155mm howitzer shells. The Americans were spending steel to save blood. They treated artillery shells as if they were free, firing millions of rounds to take a single village. But it wasn't just the quantity of fire, it was the sophistication. The Americans introduced a terrifying artillery technique known as time on target, TOT. In a standard barrage, shells fall randomly over time. You hear the first one, you dive for cover, and you might survive. But the American time on target mission was mathematically perfect. A dozen different artillery batteries, located miles apart, would calculate the flight time of their shells precisely. They would fire at different times, some early, some late, so that every single shell from hundreds of guns arrived at the target at the exact same second. To the German soldier on the receiving end, there was no warning whistle. There was just a sudden, instantaneous erasure of the world. One moment, silence. The next moment, 1,000 explosions happening simultaneously. It broke the psychological will of even the hardest SS veterans. And behind this wall of fire was the engine that made it possible: logistics. While the German army in 1944 was still largely powered by horses, dragging their supplies on wooden wagons through the mud, the U.S. Army was entirely motorized. The Red Ball Express became a legend that drove the Germans to despair. It was a never-ending conveyor belt of trucks, driven mostly by African-American soldiers, running 24 hours a day, driving at high speeds with their headlights off, ferrying gasoline, food, and ammunition from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines. German commanders would look at their maps and calculate that the Americans must stop to refuel. They must run out of shells. But the Americans never stopped. General George Patton famously said, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." And the gas always came. This was the rich man's war. It was a war where a fresh pair of dry socks was delivered to the front line faster than a German order could be sent by telegraph. It was a war where the enemy didn't just defeat you with strategy. They buried you under a mountain of brass and lead, proving that no amount of courage could stand against an unlimited budget and an endless assembly line. December 1944, the Ardennes forest. The Third Reich was dying, but it had one final, desperate breath left. Adolf Hitler stripped his Eastern Front of its best armor and hurled it at the Americans in the West. His plan was built on the same assumption he had held since 1941. The Americans were fair-weather soldiers. Hitler believed that the Americans fought only because they had air superiority and warm beds. He believed that if he attacked them in the freezing snow, under a blanket of heavy fog that grounded their airplanes, their fragile morale would shatter like glass. He was betting everything on the idea that the American soldier was soft. On December 16th, the Battle of the Bulge began. 200,000 German troops and thousands of tanks smashed into the thin American lines. At first, it looked like Hitler was right. American units were overrun. Chaos reigned. But the German offensive soon slammed into a small, insignificant town in Belgium called Bastogne. Bastogne was a critical road junction. Holding it was the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. They were surrounded. They were outgunned. They had no winter clothing. They were running out of ammunition. And it was one of the coldest winters in European history. By all laws of military logic, they were finished. On December 22nd, German soldiers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried a typed letter from the German commander. It was a formal demand for surrender. The letter explained that the Americans were totally encircled and faced annihilation if they did not give up. It was a chance to save their lives. The American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, read the note. He didn't panic. He didn't ask for terms. He laughed. He took a piece of paper and scribbled a single word in reply. A piece of American slang that confused the German translators for days. The message read, "Nuts." That single word was the death knell of the German worldview. It was the moment the Nazis realized that the mongrel nation had a spine of solid steel. The Americans didn't surrender. They dug foxholes in the frozen ground and fought off wave after wave of panzer attacks with dwindling supplies. While the 101st held the line, the rich man's war kicked into high gear. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army to the south, did something that German generals considered impossible. In 48 hours, he disengaged an entire army from combat, turned them 90 degrees, and drove them through a blizzard to relieve Bastogne. It was a feat of logistics and mobility that no other army in the world could have accomplished. When the skies finally cleared on December 26th, the end came swiftly. The American Air Force returned to the skies, blotting out the sun and raining destruction on the exposed German columns. The supply trucks broke through the snow. The infinite reserves had returned. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the old Prussian commander, looked at the ruin of his army and understood the final lesson. For years, Germany had told itself that they were the superior warriors, that they had the will while America only had the machines. The Ardennes proved them wrong. The Americans had the machines, yes. They had the best trucks, the most planes, and the most supplies. But in the freezing forests of Belgium, starving and surrounded, the American soldier proved he also had the grit to look death in the face and laugh. Germany had started the war mocking a nation of refrigerator makers. They ended the war being crushed by a superpower that was superior in industry, superior in logistics, and ultimately superior in spirit. The sleeping giant hadn't just woken up. He had stood up, fought back, and proved to the world that America was simply built different.